It was a cold, gray morning when Jamal walked into the workshop, the clink of his boots echoing against the concrete floor. The workshop was a cacophony of sounds, the steady hum of the overhead lights, the low rumble of an engine being tuned, the sharp hiss of a welding torch. The scent of oil and metal was thick in the air, a familiar smell that Jamal had grown to love. At 25, Jamal had been working at the motorcycle workshop for almost 2 years. It wasn't his dream job, but it was a job. He had always been passionate about bikes, even as a kid, watching his uncle tinker with his old Harley-Davidson. But he had never thought he'd make a career out of it. That was until he got his first bike, an old Yamaha, and decided to fix it up himself. From there, he found himself apprenticing at this small, bustling workshop owned by Mr. Green, a grizzled mechanic in his late 50s, who had a reputation for bringing old bikes back to life. Jamal entered the workshop, greeted by the sight of Mr. Green hunched over a bike, his hands deep in the engine. "Morning, kid," Mr. Green muttered without looking up. "Got a few things on the list for you today." Jamal nodded, his eyes scanning the rows of bikes lined up in various states of disrepair. He wasn't the best mechanic in the shop yet, but he had learned a lot over the past 2 years. He knew the basics: changing tires, fixing brakes, adjusting the chain. But today, Mr. Green had tasked him with something a bit more complicated: tuning the carburetor on a vintage Ducati. "Got it," Jamal said, heading over to the workbench where the Ducati sat. The owner had dropped it off earlier, complaining about a rough idle and poor acceleration. Jamal had worked on carburetors before, but this particular model was notorious for being tricky. As he removed the tank and carefully started to inspect the carburetor, he thought about how much he had grown since starting the job. When he first walked in, he was nervous, unsure of his skills. But Mr. Green had a way of teaching, of showing rather than telling, and that made all the difference. He learned how to listen to an engine, how to read its rhythms and quirks, like a language only a mechanic could understand. Hours passed as Jamal carefully cleaned the carburetor and adjusted the idle screw, taking extra care to make sure everything was perfectly in tune. As he worked, the sounds of the workshop faded into the background. It was just him and the bike, and for a moment, he felt completely in control, like he could fix anything that came his way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reassembled the carburetor and reattached the tank. He turned the key and pressed the starter. The engine sputtered to life, purring smoothly, the idle steady and strong. Jamal leaned back, wiping his hands on a rag and smiling. It wasn't perfect, yet there were still a few fine adjustments to be made. But it was a huge step forward. He called Mr. Green over to take a low,